Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1000 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. Today we have a Sicilian Defense, and I go for my A3 system, which by the way I have a playlist linked below with every game on my channel in this system. The idea is to try to play b4 after a move like knight to c6, and gambit the a and b pawns for the c pawn, bait the knight into into b4, and then play c3, d4, take a plunger space in the center, loads of traps, but my opponent doesn't allow it, unfortunately. Goes d6, and here, the game kind of switches, because a3 doesn't make sense anymore, because we don't have a target on c6 to go after with like b4, b5 if the gambit is declined. So what we need to do is, firstly, try to stop d5. Secondly, try to justify the move pawn a2 to a3, because if we can't justify it, we are just kind of down a tempo. And okay, my opponent plays e6, which is a very common idea to try and support a d5 push. Now, the way we're going to justify the move pawn to a3 is with bishop to a2. Now, bishop a2, it serves a couple of functions. Firstly, we are not vulnerable to any knight to a5 ideas in the future, because we want to play the move d3. I think we should probably play it now. Let me think a second. D3, d5... Bishop to... yeah, we have bishop g5 there. So when we play the move d3, we would potentially be vulnerable, especially if black plays a move like a6 to knight to a5 if our bishop is on c4, and we'd probably lose the bishop. So, giving it the a2 square not only means that if d5 is played, it doesn't come with tempo on the bishop, but also means that our bishop is not vulnerable to being attacked by this knight and trapped by this knight. So we're going to play the move f4, and the point of f4 is to meet d5 with e5. We don't really want to trade off our e-pawn in most cases, and the move e5 takes space on the king side. Now, d5, e5 of course does block our bishop off, but there's a very good chance that we rotate our knight to e2 in the future, play something like c3, d4, and drop the bishop back to b1 to get on a very strong diagonal. It's a very long-term plan, admittedly, and likelihood is it doesn't actually get played in this game. But it's just good to know that if d5, e5 is played, our bishop is not going to be locked out forever. There will be a way to get it back into the game, even if it takes a while. So it's a very interesting opening. And, you know, we don't get to play the gambit lines. Sure, that's kind of annoying. However, we can still get some very interesting attacking ideas. We're going to castle. And the general theme of this opening now is f5. Black will try to play d5. We will probably try to play f5, although plans might change. One of the critical moves here... try and find... there's a few moves that you can play, but one of the main plans that I like to play is knight to e2. Now, c4 does sometimes get played, trying to overload the d pawn because our knight is no longer defending the e4 pawn. But now we play knight to g3. We will likely play the move c3 to stop the knight coming into d4. Although even if the knight does come into d4, we could then just meet that with c3 anyway. c3 also prepares our bishop coming to b1. And if like d4, e5, of course our bishop will open up on this long diagonal. And what is the other idea in this position? It is f5. I had an over-the-board tournament game against like a 2200 rated player where we got not the same position, but a relatively similar position where I managed to execute the move f5. And my opponent played e5 because he didn't want to allow my knight into f5, which would be pretty devastating. And the problem is that this diagonal just became incredibly weak and very difficult for him to defend. My opponent continues his queenside expansion. I think f5 makes a lot of sense. Again, taking looks suicidal. Of course, my opponent can't do nothing, otherwise I will just win the e6 pawn. And a lot of people actually just hang the e6 pawn because they're so scared of taking and just completely forget that it is actually hanging. If you try to defend with a move like queen d7, there's probably some lines where you can take and go knight g5 to try to apply more pressure. And then like meet knight d4 with c3. King h1 is also an idea in some of these lines because this diagonal can be a little bit annoying at times, especially if the knight jumps into g4. It could be frustrating, but for the time being, that is completely fine. Again, c3 is a move you want to play at some point, and you should be noticing by now that a lot of our pieces are staring directly to the black king side. Now, of course, there's a lot of other things going on in the position. Black is trying to expand on the queen side. He may try to strike in the center. He may close up the center. But it is obvious that our plan is to try to attack black on the king side. One of the other downsides of the move e5 is that it could become impossible for black to play d5 because the c-pawn has already advanced to the c5 square. For example, in that game I'm referencing, the over-the-board game, at some point I played the move c4. Now, in that game, the pawn wasn't on b5, but c4 locked down the d5 square, meaning that this light-squared bishop really couldn't see the light of day the whole game, which is a bit of a problem. And my opponent's thinking, and it's a good time to him to be thinking, because he needs to decide, is he going to take, is he going to push, or is he going to defend? He has to choose one of them. None of them look that appealing. He goes bishop c8, okay. Now, taking feels wrong. Taking feels wrong because he takes with the bishop and he challenges my very strong bishop. I don't really want to allow that. Knight g5 looks interesting, trying to apply more pressure. There's not really any discoveries with this knight moving and the bishop hitting the knight because my knight can always take back, or this knight can take, and I have ample support. So knight g5 adds another attacker to this pawn. It's not really clear how it can be defended again. So black would either take, in which case I'd take with the knight, and then if bishop takes, rook takes, knight d4, rook drops back. That looks pretty comfortable. My bishop is really, really strong there, and c3 will kick the knight away. If knight to g5, of course, I don't think black can defend. Knight d4, we just go c3. So in knight g5, you can't defend. Taking looks a little bit bad. The other option is to push, and maybe the plan is to try and go d5 anyway. I suppose if knight g5, d5 could be played. That is a move, although it looks very strange. We could, of course, leave the tension in the position, but I also don't want a trade on f5 to force my e-pawn to the f5 square. For example, if I were to play a move like c3 here, which wouldn't be a terrible move, typically it is played in these structures, after something like ef4, knight f4, bishop f4, pawn f4, I lose my control of the d5 square, and my pawn seems to be clogging up the attack. It doesn't really seem to be helping me. So taking is a little bit tempting, but I don't really want to trade the bishops off. Let's say I do trade the bishops off, though. Let's say I do, with the plan to meet d5 with e5, supported by the knight. It's an interesting idea. A move like bishop to f4 might be playable. Take. If pawn takes, then that's absolutely fine. My bishop remains very strong, and this bishop is passive. So take, bishop takes. I probably have to take. Pawn takes. Knight g5 doesn't seem to do anything, because queen d7 defends the pawn, and I don't really have a way to add more pressure. My knight seems a bit in no man's land on g5, just ready to get kicked out. So take, 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 take. The open F file seems like it maybe benefits black. Maybe c3 is a good move. Preparing d4. Maybe just king to h1. Making sure I never get checked. If d5, e5, that looks fine. Maybe c3 is better, anticipating the move d5 and preparing e5, d4 to drop my bishop back to b1. I'd love to play a move like knight h4, just supporting the pawn, but then there are actually discoveries against the knight, so that doesn't really work. I suppose I could move this knight to, like, d2, so the rook supports the pawn, so that if take, I don't have to take with a pawn, I can take with a rook, but my knight on d2 feels like it's very much in the way. It's not really helping. Maybe... Why did I reject knight to... I rejected knight g5 on the basis of d5. Yeah, and I can't play e5 because my knight doesn't support the e5 square, right? So, yeah, the knight doesn't really have another good square. Here. It doesn't look like what I want. It doesn't look correct. That's a pretty interesting position. I think I should take. I can't find a better option, so let's take. Taking with the pawn looks wrong. Yeah, so bishop takes. We should probably take the bishop. F takes. And, okay. Now what? Well, if knight g5, queen d7 defends. Of course, knight d4 gets met with c3. So knight d5, queen, oh my god, knight g5, queen d7. Maybe knight h5? No, that feels a bit premature. Basically trying to get my queen involved, but... I don't really have a threat there, do I? Oh, maybe I do. Knight g5, queen d7, knight h5. If takes, I'm threatening this and this. That looks pretty good. If my opponent takes the knight, then I take with the bishop. That looks very active. Maybe this knight is annoying, but I don't think so. I could play a more patient move like c3. And meet d5 with e5, and if... Oh no, knight g4 is annoying. I don't like knight g4. So I think I'm going to go knight g5. I'm not 100% sure on this move, but it looks natural. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far and haven't already, please drop a like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. The only thing I have to be concerned about here is if my knight gets kicked away in a bad manner, kind of. Like, I don't want it to get kicked away for nothing and me to be wasting my time hopping my knight around for no reason. Knight h5. Take. He could take on f1. King take. Rook f8. King g1. He could play h6, stopping the attack on h7. That's true. Maybe I should be a little bit patient. I don't know, because I do have to be careful of the fact that h6 does kick my knight away. Maybe I can claim that's weakening, though, because it does weaken g6, to be fair. A move like bishop e3 does look good. Simply developing a piece. However, I can't meet the move d5 with e5 in that line. And I don't want to trade. Bishop f4, therefore, seems like a valid move. If h6... Knight to h3? Keeping the f-file open. If e5, that should benefit me. I think. If d5, then I have e5. The knight doesn't have this square because my queen controls it. Okay. Bishop f4. h6, knight h3. I'm preparing the move knight h5 there. That is an idea. C3 can be thrown in at any time, but I'm not particularly concerned about the knight coming into d4. I can probably just boot it away. I just don't have a good way of adding pressure here. Maybe c3 prepares queen b3, though, with a double attack. That's true. c3 is a useful move anyway. If c3 h6... I don't have the double attack in that line, but knight h3 trying to come into f4, because the f4 square wouldn't be occupied by the bishop, that's a really strong square for many reasons. Yeah, I think c3 is good. I think I like this. And if a move like b4, getting rid of the b5 weakness, then queen b3 anyway? Although maybe d5 is an issue, which would block my queen's attack on e6 as well. Maybe I've overlooked that, although I don't think it's the end of the world. Because the trade here probably benefits me. Okay, yeah, he does go for it. Queen to b3. Let's say b4? I don't have enough support to be taking, really. Because d3 will just be weak. I could... No, bishop f4 gets met with e5. Although, inducing e5 could allow my knight to come into f5, which would be a really good square. Queen e2 might be a very solid move, encouraging this trade, which I think benefits me because e6 is very weak. Also, b5 would hang, and if the pawn moves up, I get the f5 square. It's not a bad idea. If my opponent pushes to d4, is that a move? Because here there's this. I don't really want to take. So maybe queen b3 is better because I can meet this with winning the e6 pawn. And if take, I still just take. My opponent could play queen d3, but that hangs this pawn and he doesn't have a good follow-up. So I think I like queen b3. Hopefully all of that reasoning makes sense. Now, it is worth noting that a4 is an idea. I don't think I can take, because rook f2 b8, and my queen looks like it's completely trapped. So I've got to be careful. Got to be careful. On a4, I'll probably play queen c2. And I don't think this pawn is actually that good on the a4 square. My opponent could maybe try to go knight a5, knight b3, but it doesn't really do anything. I mean, if a4, queen c2... Oh my god. a4, queen c2, knight a5. I can get this bishop to a square like, I don't know, f4. There's no e5 because this knight doesn't support the e5 push. And if knight b3, just rook e1 or d1, and why is the knight on b3? It's not really that good a piece. It's better on c6, I think. So that's not a problem. I am, however, down to 5 minutes, which is more of a problem. That is not a move I considered. Queen now defends that. That's interesting. I could take... Do I gain anything from that? I don't think so. I could sack the pawn. Do I gain anything from that? I also don't think so. I could go d4. That's an interesting idea. If take... Knight c4. The knight isn't that impressive. I don't think. Bishop f4 looks fine. I think d4 makes sense. If d4, c4, he does get control of the d3 square. Queen c2. If knight d3, e5. Knight g4. Bishop d2. My position looks tender, but I think it's fine. And I also have potential ideas on h7, maybe. Very interesting. Okay, what other options do I have? What other options? I could take, but that just gets rid of black's weakness, if nothing else. So I don't really see the point in that. I could go for the immediate queen c2. It feels like I'm making a concession there, though, but it may be a necessary one. If here, I still have to go for this same line. Not thrilled. Not thrilled. But I'm going to play it because I don't really think I have that much of an option, to be honest. Yeah, the e5 square may turn out to be very important, which maybe I should have figured out already. I think I have to go d4 here. Feels like I should. And knight d3 seems like the best move. Don't really see another option. And it's a very strong knight, but the question is whether it's pivotal. Is it pivotal or not? Remains to be seen. I feel like e5 has to be played. e5, knight g4. Bishop d2 should be okay there. That should be okay. I'm also blocking this queen from ever getting to the king side unless it like re-maneuvers itself, which saves me time. And if this comes to any kind of endgame, e6 should be a very weak pawn. Should be a very weak pawn. And if we can manufacture some kind of kingside attack, the pawn on e5 will be very useful because it controls the vital f6 square, which is very useful for knights defending h7 or bishops defending g7, right? I'm not saying we're going to checkmate our opponent or anything anytime soon, but it's worth keeping in mind. On knight to g4, I would love to play the move h3. I'm just a little bit concerned about rook f1. So bishop d2 I like, because if rook f1 I can take back with the rook. I suppose he could maybe try and put a piece on f2. True. Could play like knight to h3 to be ultra solid, but again he takes on f1, and I don't love that. Knight f3 does stop him taking on f1, and stops anything from coming to f2. I prepare the move h3. If here knight takes, queen takes, to stop knight to e3, of course. Maybe that's good. Just backing up and like taking control over the position again. I think I like this move. Because I'm not ready to be trading rooks, I don't think. I'd like to keep the rooks on the board for the time being, because if the dynamics of the position seem to be going in black's favor, because he's got some very strong pieces. However, if you were just to look at the pawn structure, I would say that white clearly has the advantage in a structural sense. Therefore, if I can try to minimize black's dynamic play, then the long-term structural weaknesses should favor me. I hope that makes sense. The whole idea of dynamic versus static is a very important chess concept if you have never heard of it. We also have the h5 square for the knight in the future if we want it. This knight can always return to g5. We may want it on e1 at some moment to try and dislodge the knight on d3. But it remains to be seen whether this knight will be as much of a nuisance as it looks or not. We have to be pragmatic here. We can't just say, oh, scary knight, we need to do whatever we can to get rid of it. The rest of our position still needs to function. And if we can play a move like h3 and kick the knight away, then we probably take, and I'd say we're probably better, if not winning, because of how weak Black's kingside is. And yes, he's got a brilliant knight on the d3 square, but all it really does is attack b2. And as long as b2 doesn't fall, then so what? We may even have ideas of knight h5, knight to f6 at the correct moment, which could be pretty deadly. So, you know, it looks a little bit scary, but all is certainly not lost. Unfortunately, though, I'm very much down on time. You know, 2 minutes 30 compared to 8 minutes 40 is quite a difference. So I may have to shut up a bit during my moves and really think about what to play. But of course, I will be going over it in a little bit more depth in the analysis if there is anything that I missed or failed to mention that you may be wondering. If knight c1, I of course can't take with the rook because knight to e3 forks my queen and my rook. So I think I have to take with the queen. But, you know, I will proceed with h3, kick the knight away, and that's fine. Okay. b4, I don't really care about. As long as I don't take, it should be fine. b3 is not scary. That helps me. It locks everything up. Let's go h3. And now this actually looks really dangerous for Black. He can't allow the doubling of the pawns like this. I don't think he can anyway. And the only other option is to take the bishop first, and then go knight h6, trying to come into f5. But then Black loses his best piece, arguably. So, yeah, I don't know. b4 seems like a strange decision. I don't know what a better decision was, to be fair. I think he wasn't expecting the move knight to f3, but I think it was the best move. Okay, let's see what he does. I expect knight to h6. I expect we'll get this trade, and he'll try and use the g file against me. That's what I think he'll do, which looks like a decent plan. It is difficult. This is a difficult position. Don't get it twisted. I said that I don't care about b4, but, you know, if the pawns get traded, I do have to be concerned about a rook getting to b3 potentially, or even a queen getting to b3. I do have to be concerned about that, but I think I can hold on there and hopefully beat my opponent on the king side. Of course, with knight h6, I don't necessarily have to take this knight, but I feel like I should. It feels too strong to let it live, you know? Feels way too strong. And also it weakens the f6 square massively if my opponent has to play g takes h6. And I have a feeling if we get this continuation, right, if I go on to win the game, it will be because of the f6 square. Yes, okay, he does take on c1. I have to take with a queen. Well, technically I could take with this rook, but no, I should take with the queen to stop knight to e3. Knight to h6 is forced. And the knight will probably try to come into f5, which is clearly a decent square for it. Now, we could take. Pawn takes. And then queen d2. Our c3 pawn will be weak after a trade like this, but it won't be deathly weak. e6 is, you know, also very weak. My opponent has a bishop, I do not. This is a decent bishop as well, because his pawns are on light squares. It's quite a strong bishop. Not clear how we could get rid of it. My knight could come into the h5 square, but I'm not really sure what function it serves. We could rotate a knight to f4, but again, I'm not sure what function it serves. If this knight comes to f5, I probably have to take. What else can we do? We could take. And now knight to f5 doesn't make as much sense, because you have to take with the pawn, giving me a passed e pawn. Knight g5. The trade should favor me. but I don't know what my knight is actually doing there. I could go knight g5 straight away, I suppose. I think I like queen d2. Or do I? No, I'm going to do this. Firstly, I'm going to take so that the a3 pawn never becomes a weakness for the bishop. If I do get left with a weak c-pawn, at least the bishop won't be able to see it quite as easily. Taking, I don't think helps me. I mean, I get the g5 square for a piece, but, like, so what? Maybe queen g5? Trying to play knight to h5? Take, queen g5. I mean, even knight f5 is good, though. So I think queen d2 is the move I'm going to play. Not sure how to necessarily push for an advantage here, but it's going to be an interesting battle of whether c3 or e6 is weaker. That's pretty much what this looks like it's going to come down to. And if, like, knight f5 and we do get a trade, is the bishop better than the knight in this scenario? There's a good chance it is, because my pawns are stuck on dark squares. However, it won't be able to defend the light squares, but my knight has to be on a dark square to attack a light square. So maybe the bishop can stop my knight from attacking and attack. Don't know, though. Don't know. I think I've maneuvered this relatively well. A trade on the A file could leave black vulnerable to a rook getting into a6 for me. I still do have ideas of knight g5, because the trade should be good for me. However, if we don't trade, why is my knight on g5? I'm not really sure what it's doing there. I only have 50 seconds, though, so it seems like it's going to be more so down to my opponent and what he goes for. Maybe a move like queen to b5, trying to infiltrate b3 without giving me the a file. Would make sense, but it would also weaken e6. Something like queen here, maybe knight here makes a lot of sense. Because after takes, I am actually trying to play knight to h5 to take advantage of these squares. Okay, rook a7. That's interesting. Okay. Trying to double up. Cool. I'm going to take. Knight g5. Rook f1. That doesn't work. I'm going to go for this. I'm not going to lie, I'm not particularly convinced of this move, but I'm still going to play it. I'm not really sure what else to do. He's going after c3, so I have to try to apply pressure to e6. At least that's the way I'm thinking about it. The queen coming to a1 could be an issue. The question is, if rook f1, do I take with the king? I don't think I can allow that. If, like, queen e1, queen b2, that doesn't look good. But if rook f1, knight f1, my opponent gets the f5 square for his knight, my knight no longer controls that. In that line, I can, of course, win the e6 pawn, but no, that should be okay, actually. If he here, he has to deal with the threat. If he goes bishop takes, queen takes, my queen is very active. And a move like queen to a1 going after my weak c-pawn, I don't think is amazing for him. He could play something like queen a6, just defending. That might be the best option. Maybe knight to g3 makes sense there, just stopping knight to f5. So like queen a6, knight g3. If queen to a1, I have king to h2. Then my king is pretty safe. And e6 is still a weakness. I can't invade on f7 annoyingly, because this knight does control that square quite well. I think a trade should benefit us, because I think his king is weaker than mine. Knight to f7 is an interesting move there, though. Here, knight f7. I can't invade on e7 or d8. So, again, not entirely clear how I get in there. But if I can get my king to h2 and my knight to g3 in that line, that looks pretty active. Okay, he does take. I think knight f7 is the only move. Otherwise, I'm just going to invade. Right? Like, queen a1 looks like it can't work. Check here. Check. I think I'm winning there. Queen f... That's a move. That's a move. I don't know if it's a good one, though. Check. Queen f8. I'm not sure a queen trade is good for me. Maybe... no, I don't think it's good for me. I don't think so. I think I should keep the queens on the board. But I should invade, though. Queen f8, queen d7. If queen... No, that doesn't work. Queen here, I can give a check on c8. You have to block, and then I take on e6. So you can't do that. Can't do that. But you have to defend... Yeah, you know, this is losing, no? Check. I win this pawn. Game over. Wow. Yeah, no, that... I can just give endless checks on the back rank and keep attacking the pawn chain. I'm pretty sure black had to play knight to f7 rather than queen to f7. I think that was where he lost this game. I suppose the game isn't necessarily over just yet, but it should be. Check. Here. Here. I'm just attacking the pawn again. And if here, check, here I take. And I just repeat the process. That's pretty funny, actually. I might be able to take, but it doesn't really make sense to when my queen is so active. Why try and win a pawn up knight endgame with a weak c-pawn when I can do this instead? And yeah, you have to play queen f7. And then I give a check on d8. And then you move your queen. And then I win the pawn. And then you put the queen back. And then I give a check. And then you block with the queen. And then I go queen to c7, attacking the pawn. Then you have to defend the pawn with queen c7. Sorry, queen f7. And then queen c8 check picks up the next pawn. It's kind of hilarious. And knight f7, I think e6 wins for me. That's really funny. That's actually really funny. A very nice sequence, actually. Kind of like a ladder sort of sequence. And queen f7 is forced, otherwise you lose the c4 pawn. It might be an idea to try and put the king on h8, allow me to take this, and try and get some kind of counterplay with, like, knight to f5. I don't really believe in it, though, because there's no entry point. My king's pretty safe. With the knight on f1 as well, it's a very well-protected king, and you have no knight g4 either, because that square's controlled. I think it would be premature. Yeah, he does go for this. It would be premature for my opponent to resign, I think. But I don't really see how he comes back. I should have enough time to convert this. And the king is vulnerable on the back rank. Okay, knight f5. As expected. I've got to be a little bit careful. A little bit careful. Queen e6 looks pretty nice. Queen e6, knight h4. That doesn't threaten anything. I can just push. I'm trying to look at as many things as possible in the black position and be able to escort my pawns. The c-pawn I will leave behind, I think. I don't really care about the C pawn. It's about the D and E pawns, in my mind. Let's push. This knight has no forward movement unless he goes to the h4 square. But h4, the only useful square it looks at really is g2, which I don't see how black targets that properly. And my pawn is only 3 steps away from promotion. Okay, no, that seems too passive. I think he has to try and be aggressive. This is tempting, but I think just d6. My opponent has no checks. Even if he did, I can cover up with like king h2, knight g3. And as long as this knight can't attack the knight somehow, even if it could, I could probably defend with a move like queen g4. c7 looks good. Threatening queen to e8. Also, I'm attacking the knight. Worth noting. So if, you know, king h7 trying to get it off the back rank, I can just take the knight. And, you know, black has no good way of attacking my king. I will just play king h2, knight g3. Worst case scenario. And the only viable way to check my king is this diagonal. I mean, I suppose queen c5 check is a move. But king h2, yeah, he does go for it. King h2 looks good. And if a move like queen c3, I think I can take on c6, because if you take back, then I promote with check, and you lose your knight. If queen c3... yeah, that looks relatively clinical. I'm up a knight there, but the main point is that I have this e-pawn. Even if I lose the c-pawn and lose the d-pawn in the pursuit of getting this knight, I still have the e-pawn. And like I said before, my knight should be able to go to g3 and cover the king up from anything. As long as h5, h4 doesn't get played, which my queen can monitor, then that should be okay. Alright, that's a move. Check. King goes back. I could just take the knight, though, and promote anyway. That looks fine. He could take on e5, but again, I just go knight g3. So I think this makes the most sense. I don't think I'm blundering anything here, because, yeah, if he takes the queen, I just promote. He also doesn't have any checks there. If he takes on e5, I go knight g3, and I'm still going to promote. So the best he can do is be down a knight, but again, the e-pawn should survive, which makes this a much easier conversion. Even if the e-pawn did fall, it should be a relatively easy conversion anyway, but it makes it a little bit more complicated. Alright, let's see. There's a good chance he resigns. There's also a good chance he... oh no, he plays on. Let's promote. Of course I have to promote, otherwise he will just play queen to d5 and win the pawn, and I will lose. Okay, takes on c3, attacking this. I should probably just defend the pawn. What's the best way? Here, I'm trying to get on this diagonal, because that's his point of entry. My knight is a little bit loose, to be fair. What else can I do? Queen d5? I think I like this move, just because it gives me access to the e4 square, which can come with check. I don't know. I just prefer my queen here. It probably doesn't matter. And yeah, I want to play knight to g3, but I don't want to give my e-pawn away. Like I said, it should still be winning, even if the e-pawn does fall. But it makes my life a little bit more tricky. If I can just play knight g3... okay, yeah, that's fine. Knight g3. Queen here doesn't work, because I have queen to e4 check. And that's why I like access to the checking diagonal as opposed to being on d6. Of course, if my queen was on d6 and we had this exact same situation with the queen coming to f4, we'd still be winning, but I was thinking I can't push the pawn because my queen hangs, which just makes things a little bit more difficult. Even if I didn't have this check, after queen to f4, I could just push the pawn. My queen also monitors the h5 square, which admittedly I didn't realize until now, but that is useful. And yes, now I can secure a queen trade, and I assume my opponent will resign. Or he won't. This is not holdable. This is not holdable. g4 stops the king from entering the position. If he goes to f7 to try to go to e6, then I think I'll just play knight to c5. I like this concept of creating force fields in the endgame, where the king, we can use the force field to keep it out of the position, which makes calculation much easier. Like, if you look at the way my pieces are aligned right now, this king really struggles to get into the game. He has to go all the way around here to pose any kind of threat, by which time my king will probably just invade, right? If you've never, like, considered this concept of force fields before, I personally think it's just quite cool, but it does make endgames much easier. Let's play g5. Of course, I want to try to advance with my king, and my point is, if h5, I will play d6 check, forcing the king to e7, and then I will play king to e5. I didn't want to play it on the previous move because the king can come to f6, which is just annoying. Okay, now I can push. The king probably has to go to f8, then I can go to f6. I could take this pawn, but it's kind of irrelevant at this point. It's maybe even worth keeping it on the board, just in case I accidentally stalemate, then there's still pawn moves. I mean, the king has to move. Let's go here. Yeah, of course we could take the pawn and just push our h-pawn. That's absolutely valid, completely winning. There's a million ways to win this. Let's give the check. Play knight to e6. Why am I playing knight e6? I'm not chasing this pawn. I'm trying to play knight to g7 check to force the king out of the e8 square so that I can promote. That's the point. Check. Then I can promote with check. And I'm really not sure why my opponent's playing on here. But okay, there we go. He resigns. Very, very interesting game. Okay, the initial evaluation is that I made no mistakes, but I don't think that's the case. Unless my opponent just played an absolutely brilliant positional game, which he might have done. But yeah, let's jump into the analysis and see what the computer has to say. Okay, so let's jump into the analysis. Now, the whole point of this A3 line is to try to play this type of gambit, essentially. And I think my win rate from this position is probably like 70-ish%. It's really, really good. It's a great gambit, but my opponent doesn't allow it. The b4 doesn't really make sense here. Even if, okay, no, if black takes it, it's good, because this pawn is hard to target, and knight c6 can be met with b5. I eat my words. But black can kind of ignore it. And if I take, okay, e4 hangs in that line. But okay, let's say black just takes back. The b pawn is actually like annoying to not be there anymore. And black has really good control over the d4 square. So it's not a fantastic position. Instead, we play it in more of a Vienna style. And we try to justify the a3 move with bishop to a2. The position is dead equal. It is dead equal. But if you play this with the white pieces, like, you should know the position relatively well. So if, you know, all things being equal, if you're more comfortable and familiar with the position, likelihood is you can grind out some kind of advantage. Knight f6. Preparing the move d5, I go d3. The computer wants knight to f3, but that's not really in the spirit of the position. You want to play f4 at some point. So d3, bishop e7, f4, castles. Now d5 will be met with e5, and the computer will say this is fine. However, I find these positions incredibly comfortable to play. I'm going to castle. Let's say black continues with like queenside expansion. I want to do something like c3, d4, bishop b1, and once f5 happens, maybe knight to g3. This is basically game over. Obviously, black can try to stop me by, for example, playing d4 himself, but it's really difficult. My opponent castles. Whoa, that's not what I meant to do. Let's go back. I castle, b4, knight e2, bishop 2, b7. I did mention that c4 is sometimes an idea in these lines, because taking, I lose the e-pawn. There's also queen b6 check ideas. But here, I can just go knight to g3. c4 is only really an idea once c3 is on the board. For example, if we continue after bishop b7, if instead of knight g3, I go c3, then c4 is an option. Because if I take, again, you can take here, you can take here, you can give this check, it's good for black. And if I try to defend my e-pawn, then there is moves like cd3, queen d3, and I don't get to execute my plan of d4. d5 will probably come at some point, and it should be relatively effective. But knight g3, a5, f5, bishop c8. Bishop c8 is really the only move here. So good find from my opponent. And taking is the best. Taking is the best, so I'm happy I saw that. I considered many moves here, knight g5 being one of them. But after d5, I couldn't figure out what I'm doing. I also considered moves like bishop to f4, but ef5, knight f5, this is not a good structure. Because this pawn, it's not really all that useful, to be honest. Because there's no e-pawn to be targeting as like a hook. And the e-file is open. With an open center, attacking is more difficult. So fe6, bishop e6, and here, the computer did not like my move. I think the point is that opening the f-file benefits black. It wanted a move like bishop to f4, and if black takes, apparently that's fine. The rook on a2, I assume, will just come back to a1, but it's a strange move to play as a human. I took. And here, I should have been more patient with a move like c3. I think... Why did I reject that? I'm not sure, to be honest. I played knight g5, queen d7, and then I went c3, which is a good move. But my opponent goes d5. There's actually a really cool tactical idea here of e5. After knight e5, queen e2, if the knight moves, I take on e6, and I'm much better because I get the f5 square, I guess. So bishop d6, bishop f4, h6, bishop e5, hg5. That's really interesting. Black is up a pawn, but e6 is weak and g5 is weak, so it's difficult to defend. I went queen b3, knight e5, and yeah, I got a little bit outplayed by this whole knight e5 idea. My thought process was, okay, you can't really take because I'll take on e6. That should be very good for me. If you play a move like a4, that is actually one of the best moves here because I can't take because my queen gets trapped, so I would just have to drop my queen back. The problem is d4 gets played, and my position kind of falls apart. My opponent went knight e5. Here I should have gone d4, and the line could continue to exactly what we got in the game, but I started with queen c2. C4, d4, knight d3, and e5. And I'm worse here. However, I do find one of the best moves with knight to f3. Another was bishop d2, which was another move I considered. So I'm happy I found that. Here there is one move, and black is better. Every other move is still an advantage, but he's not better necessarily. Try and find the move for black. So it has to do with what I actually mentioned during the game. I mentioned that this queen struggles to get to the king side unless it maneuvers itself via the light squares, which I was like, well, that takes a bit of time to accomplish. the computer still thinks it's the best idea, and to be fair, time is not necessarily of the essence for the black pieces. It is tough though, because after h3, you can't, well no, you can actually go knight h6. Yeah, that is the move. And if I take, the computer claims that I guess the open G file is good for black, but it is also difficult to practically allow this structure. My opponent went b4 though, which throws away the advantage. I go h3. My opponent should have played b3 apparently, so I should have taken here first, but okay, I went h3. Knight to c1. Knight to h6 I was going to take, and white is slightly better here. He takes on c1. Queen c1 is forced. Knight h6. And here, yes, okay, the only move is ab4, so I'm very happy I played that. I considered a move like queen to d2, but I rejected it because of b takes a3, b takes a3. And this bishop ties my rook down. So I was thinking, well, my opponent could just play a move like a4, lock my pawn in place, take over the b file, and my rook is stuck defending a3, and this bishop is monitoring my knights. This bishop is a stupidly powerful piece, so I have to liquidate my a-pawn quickly. I go queen d2. b3 is the best move here. I assume trying to play rook a2 maybe, but he takes, and now we are slightly better. It should be a draw though. Rook a7, I take. I go knight to g5, my opponent takes, knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes, and here there are a lot of moves that draw. I personally like to knight to f7. I can't infiltrate anywhere, so my best is probably queen g4, queen b6 defending. And I mean, I can go like king h2 and try and go knight to g3 and maybe knight to h5, but there shouldn't be anything there for white. I suppose white is probably the better of the two parties, but there shouldn't be anything. There's also potentially interesting ideas of this, like let's say this, king h2, and black just shuffles a little bit. There's an interesting idea of, oh no, the queen covers this. My point was maybe I have like a check on the back rank and the knight has to sacrifice itself, but a little bit fanciful. But yeah, queen f7 just throws the game away. And I assume my opponent must have been thinking that I didn't have a good way to win the pawns. But I have this checking sequence, and there is simply nothing black can do. Black should have bailed earlier and gone for this line earlier, but I still don't think you can actually defend this pawn very well. Queen d8. Yeah, I'm still winning the pawn. So he goes queen f7. I go for the same trick. I go for the same trick again. I think it's actually quite cool. Quite a cool idea. And yeah, we win all the pawns. Get the queen into my opponent's territory. Push the pawn. He gives a check, but my king is perfectly safe. Sack the queen. I like this idea. And then, yeah, just save my e-pawn. For example, if in this position I'd have played knight g3, I'm still winning, but like, the e-val drops to 3 rather than being 7. This is far easier to convert. So, secure the queen trade, create this force field idea. I mean, it's obviously winning, and then my opponent resigns once we promote. A very, very interesting game. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you want to see another interesting game in this same Sicilian system, check out the video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.